Hi guys, Brook Potter here, coming to you live from Essex in the United Kingdom. In this video, I wanted to share a little bit about a private comment that I got from a friend on Facebook. Recently, I was in a online Christian singles Zoom group. This is the time of the quarantine in the UK. And, I was involved with probably like 48 people that were in that chat, men and women. And in the midst of it, I kind of went off on a little bit of a rant about some red pill truths regarding masculinity and the roles of men and women and other such things. And surprisingly, yes, one of these women in the group actually reached out to me on Facebook. And she asked me two questions, one pertaining to how people view Christianity out here in the UK. But the second one was what I want to focus on in this video, where she asked me what I thought were the main reasons why men are kind of remaining outside of the church. Now, when she asked me that question, I warned her up front, like, this is a lecture. Like, what you're asking me here, there is a ton that I can say about this. But, of course, I try to keep it brief, and I narrowed it down to 4 points. But believe me, I can go on. And I thought it'll make an interesting video if I went on to kind of expand a little bit on these topics. So that's the purpose of this video. So, yeah, let's get into it. Now, the first problem that I see in a lot of the Western churches out here is this Gnostic thinking or dualistic thinking between the spirit and the flesh. The church tends to hyper spiritualize that everything that is spiritual is good and everything that is carnal or in the physical body is considered to be evil. Now, Gnosticism was one of the early heresies in the church, and some of the church fathers and such were trying to fight against this, but nonetheless, it is very prevalent today. And the problem, of course, with this for men is that, a lot of the traits that define masculinity, such as strength, courage, competence, honor, these are very physical and natural things that we express in our bodies. And the church has taken this extreme view that only that which is spiritual is good and everything that is physical is evil. And what ends up happening is that when they push this message that you're sinful, that you have a sinful nature, that your desires are evil and all these other types of things, the very nature of men, which includes, these 4 things plus many others, is demonized. It's seen as carnal or toxic masculinity or any of these other types of things. And it sets men to fight against their nature. It emasculates men and keeps them from being confident and strong and, secure in their masculinity. As well as the church has completely skewed their relationship advice using the same type of Gnostic thinking, where, when they tell you to look for a spouse, it's all about Christian discipline. Are they in a church? What are their doctrines? Have they given themselves to prayer and to fasting and missions and all this other kind of stuff? When that is the complete opposite of what marriage is about. Marriage is a very physical and carnal relationship. You're dealing with the person. And the problem, of course, is it's very easy to hide serious mental disorders or, bad attitudes and other things behind a church facade. So a lot of guys go in, and girls, looking at somebody's Christian discipline, and they end up marrying this person based off of these, super spiritual traits that they see, and they completely ignore many of the natural attributes, such as their attitude, how they deal with conflict, some entitlement, maybe some mental disorders, bipolar, depression, all of these other types of things. That is completely overlooked in the church. And seeing as the divorce rate in the church is pretty high, in some studies it's as much, it's 50%, just like outside the church. Although I think Focus on the Family in the US did a study and showed that those at least who attend church have at least a 30% chance. It's not as high for like regular church attendees. But nonetheless, without this understanding that, you need to know the person, not just their behaviors. It's too easy to hide behind Christian disciplines and hyper spiritualize everything and make everything spiritual so important that you don't actually make that, that connection with the other individual. So this Gnostic thinking of demonizing the body, demonizing the flesh, you have a sinful nature and all these other types of things, that is not conducive to men. And a lot of that type of teaching is targeted towards men. Women don't really get into that whole thing, which will drive me into my second point. So my second point on this is that the church has no realistic answer to men's sexuality. And what I mean by this is that, yes, generally, traditionally in the church, depending on your traditions, sexual relationships are confined to the institution of marriage. And there's nothing wrong with that. That sounds like it's a great church tradition, and it appears to be supported by Scripture. The problem, of course, is in reality, men and women are getting married later and later in life. I'm almost 40. I've never been married. According to these church teachings, I should remain celibate into my 40s. Which is kind of unreasonable an expectation to put on men and women, as the case might be. Especially in this day and age where, everything has been sexualized and all of these different types of things. That's just not a reasonable argument. And worse from that, any kind of sexual expression, including masturbation, watching porn, and all these other types of things. I'm not saying these things are good or bad or anything. I'm just saying the church has no avenue for men to express their sexuality outside the confines of marriage. And that is a real dilemma. That is it's a losing battle. You're expecting men like myself and others to remain celibate into their 40s, sometimes into their 50s, without really addressing these needs. I mean, sexual expression is a need for men, and unfortunately, the church has no answer for that. So that's definitely another reason why men are kind of avoiding this type of involvement in the church, because really and truly in a lot of these traditions, they simply don't have an answer for male sexuality. The third point that I raised in this conversation was about the unhealthy church structure. Now, I don't want to go into bashing too many faith traditions. I know every branch of the church is doing something completely different. But at the end of the day, the church tends to emphasize, submission and service, which is fine. It is part of, the biblical angle of things. But for some men who tend to be more assertive or more aggressive, as the case might be, that type of behavior is not encouraged. They're not serving people to build up their leadership capacity. It tends to be a very simple formula. Every Sunday, people go to church, listen to one man preach, and then they go. There really isn't any kind of opportunity for the men in the church to exercise leadership or, to grow in any kind of capacity, although they're constantly instructed that they must submit and they must serve. And unfortunately, a lot of that tends to go in one direction. It goes from the congregation towards the leadership. It is very rare that you see a lot of the leadership serving the congregation in the same capacity. They would say, well, I preach every Sunday, or, I give my time to counseling and stuff like all these other things. That's not the same thing as submitting to one another. So, I mean, there's a lot to be said about the structure of the church, but just in general, the characteristics that make, masculinity is not encouraged in the church. And that has a lot to do with them not building up leadership and encouraging leadership amongst the men. In the structure that it is, there's usually one guy, and that, he does his message, and that's kind of it. You might be lucky to serve in the car park, or, as a greeter, or whatever the case might be. But there is never really an opportunity for men to rise up and take leadership. The last point that I raised with this lady who messaged me was about the anti-masculine message that is coming from the church. Now, I've been in a number of ministries. I've been in a number of conferences where they've done teachings for singles specifically. And there's a very unhealthy bias or anti-male slant within a lot of the messages for singles. A lot of the church has resorted to trying to shame and bash men, basically telling them they've got to man up and marry these women and all these other types of things, while at the same time, they don't really say anything about the women, right? If a man were to spin around and say that he's got standards, for instance, like maybe he doesn't want to marry a single mom, suddenly that's not loving unconditionally. That's not like loving like Christ loves the church. And there seems to be a heavy anti-male bias where the church should be supporting men to have healthy relationships. They're not really doing that. And, I'm not speaking against any one individual, but men are entitled to have standards. Men are entitled to say, well, they don't want this and they don't want that. But again, that is kind of looked down upon, and they use all of these shaming tactics to try and get men to submit and to just marry up these women. And again, I understand the premise of that, but there has to be equal responsibility on the women. And I think that is what's grossly overlooked in the church. You know, again, women seem to get a free pass. And, you know, why would I be a part of a ministry that's going to constantly shame and bash me for not wanting to marry a single mother, or, you know, have a girl who's, you know, absolutely covered in tattoos, or whatever the case might be. So again, because men are not getting that type of, you know, support or even understanding, they tend to be, you know, the targets of a lot of these messages rather than actually, you know, encouraged and edified by the church. I don't blame a lot of men for wanting to walk away from that kind of environment. I think the church has also been very irresponsible in not warning men that there are some serious dangers that are lurking for them if you get married in a Western country. The divorce court system is heavily skewed towards women. 50% of marriages generally end in divorce. Within the church, it's still 30%. And I believe that, you know, having the peer group around you definitely is you know, like a check on some of these divorces, but it still happens. I know, you know, many preachers who are on their fifth wife. So yeah, being in the church is not any kind of protection from that. But at the same time, for men, if they are maybe the primary breadwinner, which is not always the case, but can be the case, they potentially can lose up to 2/3 of their wealth if the relationship goes south and divorce comes on the table. You know, 1/3 goes to the wife, 1/3 goes to the lawyers, and he's left living on 1/3. Not to mention he might have to pay alimony and child support. He might even lose access to his kids. Because again, the courts just by default tend to favor the mother for child raising. And you know, because the woman has custody of the children, generally speaking, they're going to give her the lion's share of the resources. So again, that's not set in stone, but it's something that men should be aware of. If you're going to jump out of an airplane, you'd want to know that 50-50 chance you're actually going to make it to the ground alive, right? I mean, I know that's not a perfect analogy, but the church just seems to have this whimsical, romanticized idea about marriage that is not based in reality. Yes, marriage is a sacrament. Yes, marriage, you know, does have some benefits to it. But the risks greatly outweigh a lot of the benefits. And men by nature are risk assessors. They're going to look at the statistics and, you know, probably listen to a couple of their divorced friends and other things and just kind of amount that that's a risky proposition, especially in this day and age. So yeah, I think, again, the church has this idealistic view of marriage, again, which is not based in any kind of reality. And more men are realizing this. And this kind of spiel is not talking to them. They're too aware of what the realities of life are like to really buy into these messages. So with those things said, you know, there's a lot more that I can say on it. I don't want this video to go on too long, but those are the main points that I raised. Let me know your thoughts below. If you disagree with me, that's absolutely fine. You're by all means able to, you know, leave your comments. I might be able to respond to them. If you like this video, be sure to like, share, and subscribe if you'd like to see more. If you want somebody to maybe hear these points, please consider sharing. And as always, guys, thanks for watching. God bless.